Boldwood presents The Chase, written by Evie Hunter and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Don't let the price fall below $20 a share. Sure. Kristen's silky voice purred down the line, echoing above the engine sounds and impatient hooting of other drivers stuck on the M25, the infamous London Ring Road, more commonly referred to as a car park. Today, it was living up to its reputation, and the mood of those stuck on either side of Isaac was becoming increasingly ugly. "Get Patrick to take the shareholders' meeting," he added. "Doesn't look like I'll get there in time." "So frustrating for you," Kristen said, her voice now oozing sympathy. "Right, catch you later, possibly," he added, glancing dubiously at miles of stalled traffic ahead of him and sighing. Isaac Fernandez pushed the button on the steering wheel of his Lotus Emira, a gift to himself after completing his latest company takeover, and ended the call. The sapphire blue speed machine was drawing envious glances from fellow road users who had nothing better to do than drool. He ignored the smiles of a glamorous driver on the inside lane and thought instead about all the things he ought to be doing at that precise moment. Isaac inched his car forward. It was stop-start for miles until he reached the turnoff for the M23. On a whim, he cut across a lane when a gap appeared and took the slip road. He'd never make the shareholders' meeting, but Patrick was more than capable of deputising and taking all the inevitable flack. Perhaps the traffic stall had done him a favour, he reasoned, for the first time since he could recall, when Isaac had decided to award himself a morning off. He joined the M23, which was mercifully clear, and put his foot down. The engine responded with a purr that would have made Kristen weep with envy. Isaac felt an adrenaline surge from the sheer explosion of raw power that put him in mind of his racehorses leaving the starting gates. And that was where he planned to play hooky, he'd already decided. His 3 horses were with the latest training sensation, Guy Levant, in Newbury. Isaac seldom visited, and never without making an appointment. He didn't have the time to waste if the people who mattered weren't available to answer his questions. Besides, he wouldn't thank anyone else for interfering in the day-to-day working of his own company, and winced as his mind reverted to his demanding shareholders who were happy to take the profits as they rolled in, but also seemed to think they knew better than he did when it came to the complexities of the money markets. He was required to handle them with kid gloves, a bit like Guy was obliged to soothe the egos of eccentric horse owners. Only Guy exercised more tact and patience than Isaac customarily managed. As far as he was concerned, the trainer knew his business, and Isaac paid him a king's ransom to get the best out of his horses. It was just a hobby, albeit an expensive one, but Isaac was never off duty. He saw his status as an owner as a golden opportunity to entertain would-be clients, enticing them to place their trust in his investment company. But he had grown increasingly enthusiastic about the thrill of the chase. Having a winner gave him the same hard-on as identifying an ailing company that would benefit from his expertise in taking it over and making it profitable again did. There had been 1 or 2 disappointing results with his horses lately, but Guy had explained that he'd entered them in higher classes where the competition was stronger. It was all part of the game, and Isaac accepted that you couldn't win 'em all. Even so, Isaac didn't like failing at anything he did and wanted to reassure himself that his horses were fit and well. That was the downside of being a control freak, he reasoned. He always needed to be on top of things, to understand them, and he most emphatically didn't understand the complex world of horse racing, where charlatans appeared to lurk around every corner. An error of judgment, he said aloud, taking a wrong turning in the labyrinth of country lanes. Momentarily unsure of his location, he slowed to a crawl and realised that he was on a track that led to the back entrance to Guy's yard. The tradesman's entrance, he said aloud, chuckling. The gravel track took him directly past all the paddocks, as opposed to the parking area for owners. He felt a surge of optimism as the sun filtered through trees green with new growth, and he drove past paddocks in which leggy young horses were enjoying the spring grass. Isaac assumed they weren't in training yet. Those that were had to adhere to strict diet and exercise schedules, vital, apparently, to ensure optimum performance on the track. He'd taken the foreman's word for it. He halted the car when a familiar horse stuck its head over the post and rail fencing. A grey horse, with a distinctive dark blaze. He'd know him anywhere. It was one of his. "What the fuck?" he muttered, stopping the car and getting out to stroke Federal Force's muzzle. An inquisitive 3-year-old and Isaac's first acquisition, the horse was supposed to be racing the following week, so what the hell was he doing out to grass? He was unshod, and his coat was dull through lack of grooming. Whenever Isaac had seen him before, during one of his scheduled calls, he had been impeccably turned out and glowing with health. "Hi, fella," he said, rubbing the horse behind the ears. "Recognise me, do you?" It was highly unlikely, given that Isaac had minimal contact with his horses. His busy schedule didn't allow for anything so frivolous. His horses, just like everything else in his life, were a business investment. Besides, emotional attachment always led to disappointment, a lesson learned and never forgotten from his dysfunctional childhood. Force lost interest when he discovered that Isaac had no mints on offer, turned away, put in a massive buck, and chased down the paddock with an impressive turn of speed. More inquisitive than concerned now, there was bound to be a plausible explanation. Isaac got back in his car and drove through the impressive archway with the horses' barns on either side. He often thought that his horses lived better than a lot of the people he knew. The barns were pristine, not a blade of hay out of place. You could almost eat your dinner off the floors. He slipped his car into what was obviously the staff car park, given the array of muddy 4x4s parked there. Isaac's shiny Lotus looked as out of place as Federal Force would in a paddock full of cobs. Talk about slumming it, he thought, perfectly at home in such surroundings. He ought to be, given that he'd grown up with few advantages and only bad examples to follow, and made something of himself by virtue of his own endeavours. It could so easily have turned out very differently. He headed towards the barn where he expected to find his other 2 horses eating their heads off, but paused when he heard voices raised in anger coming from the tack room. There was no one else about. Presumably the grooms were out on the gallops, which was where Guy would be at that time of day, watching his charges being put through their paces. It was probably where Isaac should be too, so he wouldn't be caught eavesdropping. Not that he cared if he was. He had every right in the world to be here, and took a dim view of full-on arguments being conducted so openly in the middle of a working day. It was unprofessional. Isaac recognised one of the raised voices as belonging to Dale Drummond, Guy's foreman, mentor, and trusted right-hand man. And he was giving the woman he was talking to merry hell. "I don't give a flying fuck what you think. You're here to do as you're told, not use that pathetic excuse for a brain of yours and stick your oar into situations that you don't understand." "You really are a misogynistic bastard," a quiet voice, laced with seething anger, replied. "But I know what you're doing. It's not right, and I don't intend to keep quiet." A brittle silence ensued, broken only by the sound of a soft whinny from a horse in a nearby box. tension radiated, and Isaac remained right where he was, curious to know what the fight was all about. Something and nothing, he suspected. The only thing that surprised him was that Dale could be so arrogantly aggressive. Times had changed, Isaac knew, but he was old-fashioned and would never speak to a woman so disrespectfully, no matter what the provocation. And, he thought, rolling his eyes when he recalled some of the women he'd dated who didn't seem to understand when an affair had run its course, there wasn't much that anyone could teach him about provocation. Even so, he prided himself upon keeping his temper in check and remaining civil. "You know sod all, little girl." Dale's voice was deep, sinister, and patronisingly threatening. "Now get out of here. You've had your last warning. You're fired, and don't expect a reference." "You can't fire me," the woman shot back. "I work for Guy." "Wake up, darling." Dale gave an unpleasant little laugh. "I run this place, in case you weren't aware, and I decide who's hired and who's fired. Guy won't even notice you're gone. You're less than a speck of dust on his expensive boots. Now get out. You're trespassing." "But the horses, my horses." There was a wail in the woman's voice now. Clearly she loved the horses that she looked after, and the fight drained out of her when she realised that she'd no longer be caring for them. Her voice was familiar, but Isaac couldn't remember where he'd heard it before. Probably here, during one of his visits, he decided. "They aren't your horses, sweetheart. They belong to all those rich buggers with more money than sense who don't know a fetlock from a forelock." Dale's voice had turned scathing. "Now get out of here, and think yourself lucky that I haven't put the word out in the industry that you're disloyal. You'd never work with horses again if I did. You know how incestuous this world is." "You won't get away with this." The fight had returned to the woman's voice. Dale gave another harsh laugh. "Get away with what? It's all in your imagination. Still, I'll say it again. If one word of this gets out, then you'll rue the day you were born, little girl. Now go! I have work to do." The door flew open, and Isaac stood back in the shadows, not wanting to be seen and dragged into a dispute that had nothing to do with him. He needn't have worried. The woman strode straight past his hiding place, muttering uncomplimentary comments about Dale without looking in his direction. A dark ponytail flew out behind her as she headed for the staff car park, her slim hips drawing his attention, and holding it. Now Isaac recognised her. She was the lass who looked after his horses. He snapped his fingers as he recalled that her name was Farah something or other. He'd have recognised her attractive profile anywhere, even now when she was frowning as she passed him, and her large, expressive green eyes were pooled with tears. She'd led his winners in at various race meetings, beaming as though she had achieved the win in person. But he always had would-be business associates with him at such times, so they'd never exchanged more than a few words of congratulations. He'd treated her very much like the hired help, he realised with a twang of guilt. Even if that's what she was, ordinarily that wasn't Isaac's way. He prided himself on being on good terms with all his employees and accessible to them. Watching Farah's distress now, he didn't feel good about himself. He had no idea what it was that she'd faced up to Dale about, but did know that he hadn't liked Dale's bully boy tactics. He wondered if she would be able to find alternative employment, or if Dale would make good on his threat and blacken her name in the industry. Isaac was surprised by the strength of his determination to find out. He didn't have the time to get drawn into someone else's affairs, but he'd find the time. "What the hell?" he muttered, thinking back to what he'd just overheard and wondering if Dale considered him to be a rich bugger with more money than sense. He scowled at the very real possibility, and that in turn strengthened his resolve. Dale wouldn't be the first to underestimate the boy made good from the East End. He waited a few minutes, then moved away from his hiding place when the clatter of hooves on cobbles heralded the return of the string that had been out on the gallops. He was waiting outside Force's empty box when the horses were led into the barn. "Isaac!" Isaac turned at the sound of Dale's voice, now hospitable and full of bonhomie. If Isaac hadn't heard him berating Farah, he never would have believed him capable of being such a Jekyll and Hyde character. There again, he'd had his moments himself when someone had tried to put one over on him. Probably best not to jump to conclusions about what he'd overheard, he decided. Farah was attractive, dedicated to her chosen, poorly paid profession, but he mustn't let her looks sway him. As long as his horses were fit and running well, that was all that counted. His thoughts returned to Force, turned out to grass, and his doubts returned. "Dale," Isaac replied, taking the foreman's outstretched hand. "I was passing, so thought I'd drop by." "Always welcome," Dale said, "although I thought you financial types were glued to your computer screens." "Don't believe everything you read. I like to keep a personal eye on my investments. Talking of which," he added, watching the horses being untacked, rubbed down and returned to their boxes, "where's Force?" He's sprained a fetlock, which will put him out of work for a few weeks. He's out in a small paddock. The vets recommended light exercise." That was total twaddle, and increased Isaac's mild suspicions. Could Force be the reason why Farah had taken Dale on? She clearly loved his horses, and he'd noticed her dedication to them at race meetings. Isaac, who admittedly hadn't known much about horses when first becoming an owner, now at least knew that much. He never made an investment without doing research, and the care and welfare of racehorses had been his chosen bedtime reading for months now, unless he had a date who was willing to distract him. Besides, if the horse was injured, he would have been turned out alone. Isaac recalled Force bucking, and the manner in which he'd galloped the length of the paddock without showing the slightest sign of lameness. Something was definitely off, but Isaac knew better than to show his hand before delving deeper, and merely nodded, the obedient dupe. "Come and see your other two." Dale clapped Isaac's shoulder. "They're just back from the gallops." Isaac duly admired federal compliance and federal dalliance, both of whom looked fit and full of running. He pretended not to notice that they were being looked after by a lad he'd never seen before, and didn't ask after Farah. "Will you come up to the office?" Dale asked. "Guy will be back and glad to see you. Besides, the sun's over the yard arms somewhere. I dare say a nip of whiskey would slip down as smooth as you like." Since it was only 11 in the morning, Isaac could have given the man an argument on that score, but refrained. His florid face and the broken blood vessels decorating his nose were, Isaac guessed, not just a consequence of living the outdoor life. This man enjoyed his whiskey, perhaps a little too much, making Isaac wonder why an ambitious trainer of Guy's ilk put so much trust in him. "Thanks, but I need to be somewhere." "Sure you do." Dale laughed easily as he gave Isaac's person, clad in a Savile Row silver-grey suit, a disparaging once-over. "Money to be made is my guess. If you want these equines of mine to eat, then I guess you're right." Isaac laughed. Two could put on an act, he decided, now deeply suspicious of Dale's motives. He took his leave and went back to his car, wondering how to find Farah. He had some questions that he wanted to put to her, to say nothing about feeling responsible for her welfare. But he didn't even know her surname. Farah stumbled towards her beaten-up Suzuki Jeep, her vision blurred by the tears pouring down her face. Tears of anger, tears of regret. She should have kept what she suspected to herself, but hadn't wanted to believe it, and felt duty-bound to share those suspicions with Dale. Dale, who had been a bit like a surrogate uncle to her, always willing to get his hands dirty when they were short-staffed, always friendly. He'd forgotten more about horses than she was ever likely to learn, and she had trusted him. Well, the blinkers had well and truly come off after that little encounter, she decided, dashing at the tears with the back of her hand as she took 3 attempts to unlock her car. It was so old that it predated key fob locking and was literally on its last legs. She spared a scathing glance for Isaac Fernandez's flashy Lotus, thinking he must be slumming it to be parked amongst the oi polloi. She hadn't known he'd planned to visit today, and wondered if Dale did, maliciously hoping that the hapless owner would catch Dale out in a lie. Not that he ever would, she accepted, turning the key and simultaneously pumping the accelerator to encourage the engine to turn over. It did so on the 3rd attempt, but the fuel light blinked red at her. Shit! She thumped the dashboard with her fist, aware that she couldn't afford to fill up, and likely wouldn't get home on what was left in the tank. She'd been running on fumes for days. Defiantly, she left the vehicle where it was, got out, and resigned herself to a walk to the bus stop. The buses ran infrequently out here in the wilds, hence the need for a car, but one would come eventually and deposit her at the cottage she shared with her disabled aunt. Farah was her carer and depended upon her earnings from the yard to supplement the pittance that Aunt Daisy got from social services. Now what the hell would she do to make ends meet? She stopped at the paddock where Force was enjoying the spring grass and getting far too fat to race. She called to the horse, and he trotted over to see her, anxious for a treat. "Why the hell not, eh, boy?" she asked, patting his neck and producing a packet of mints from her pocket. She loved this horse with every fibre of her being. The other 2 were decent runners, but this one had character, a personality that had gotten to Farah, and fresh tears tumbled down her cheeks when she realised that she would never see him again. She chose to believe that the soft creature would miss their conversations. Well, Force didn't actually contribute to those conversations, she conceded. Farah did all the talking as she groomed him until his coat shone, but he was an excellent listener. She buried her face in his neck and sobbed her heart out. Force, always intuitive to her moods, nudged her with his nuzzle, and not, Farah chose to believe, because he was after another mint. She eventually fed him another anyway, then gave his neck a final pat and forced herself to walk away. She didn't trust herself to look back without breaking down, but knew that the horse would still be at the fence watching her go. Another 10 minutes took her to the bus stop. She looked at the timetable secured behind perspex and saw that she'd just missed one. Of course she had. She had the best part of an hour to wait for another to come along, and so she sat down to have a good think about her future. Not that there was much to think about. Despite what Dale had said, she knew he would start rumours about her, if only to account for her abrupt departure. She was popular with the owners, and they were bound to ask why she'd left. Well, popular with the majority of them, she mentally amended, her head full of visions of the admittedly handsome but remote Isaac Fernandez, who was probably unaware of Farah's existence. There was nothing else for it. She would have to find an office job with regular hours so that she would be free to care for Daisy and her MS. She was getting steadily worse, and it was only a matter of time before she would require full-time residential care. Farah's heart sank at that thought. Her cottage would have to be sold to pay for the care in question, which would leave Farah not only jobless, but homeless too. That was in the future, though, and hopefully not for another year or more. Farah's concerns, on the other hand, were of the more immediate variety. "Office work it will just have to be," she muttered, thinking longingly of the horses she would never get to ride again, of the fresh air nipping at her cheeks as she rode at a flat-out gallop, with Force's powerful muscles shifting seamlessly beneath her. She was lulled out of her pity party by the sound of a car reversing up to the bus stop, and the driver sounding his horn. She wanted to tell him to get lost, but the words stalled when she recognised Isaac's distinctive penis compensator of a car. "Need a lift?" he asked, as the passenger side window glided silently down. "Farah, isn't it?" She blinked at him. "Oh, so you know my name?" She regretted the acerbic response the moment it left her lips, but wasn't about to apologise for it. He seemed more amused than offended, as evidenced by his chuckle. God, but he was handsome, she thought, watching the sun dancing off his rugged features. A sweep of thick, dark hair fell across his eyes, and he impatiently pushed it aside with the long fingers of one hand. "Having a bad day?" he asked. "Trust me," she replied, "you have no idea." "Want to talk about it? Come on, hop in. I don't bite." Did she want to talk about it? And would this Adonis believe her even if she did, given that she had little more than her suspicions and the odd snippets of conversation she had overheard to back up her assertions? She thought of Force, of his lovely soft muzzle and friendly disposition, and it was enough to make her mind up. "My boots will make the inside of your glossy car all dirty," she warned. "That's okay." His smile was wide and glamorous, sending an infusion of blood to the parts of her anatomy where it was needed the least. She was most definitely off men. They were more trouble than they were worth. And even if that wasn't the case, she and this one moved in totally different circles. She smiled as she wondered when he'd last shopped in a supermarket. He was bound to be above such mundane occupations as doing the weekly shop, on a budget or otherwise, and probably had a ton of minions who catered for his domestic arrangements. "Okay," she said, slipping into the passenger seat of the low car with as much elegance as she could muster. "But don't say you haven't been warned. Mind you, I don't suppose you have to clean up after yourself, so why should you care?" He laughed. "I wonder why you would think that. It doesn't do to jump to conclusions," he said. "You don't know anything about me." Oh, yes, she did. She'd read every word she could find about him online. He ran a successful finance company called Federal Finance. His horses were business expenses to him, hence the prefix of Federal to all their names. He rescued ailing companies and sold off the profitable bits. Oh, and he was constantly being photographed in the newspapers with the latest supermodel on his arm as he attended various red carpet affairs. He was Spanish or half Spanish, as evidenced by his olive complexion and dark good looks, and spoke several languages fluently. He had a degree in business management from Oxford, probably first class, she mused, feeling uncharitably inclined towards a man who had everything, when she struggled so hard to make ends meet and give Daisy's life as much comfort as possible. He was supposedly a self-made man, but Farah found that hard to believe. He was only in his mid-30s. That hadn't been enough time for even the sharpest of minds to amass so much wealth if his business hadn't been given a kickstart. The engine roared back into life as he moved the car away from the bus stop. No doubt it had offended his car's sensibilities to be seen at such a lowly location, Farah assumed, wondering if she was losing her mind, given the turn her thoughts had taken. The sound system was tuned to a classic rock station, the volume down low, and he drove efficiently, without feeling the need to make conversation. Farah had been up since 6, and had recently undergone the added trauma of being sacked from a job she loved. She was on emotional overload and physically exhausted. The soft purr of the engine lulled her, and her eyes fluttered to a close. They jerked open again when the car came to a halt, and she realised she hadn't told him where she lived. "Where are we?" she asked, blinking. "At the Fox and Ferret," he said, nodding through the window to the quaint country pub. "You looked so peaceful that I didn't want to wake you. Let me buy you lunch. Then you can tell me what you were arguing with Dale about." Chapter 2. Isaac, driving slowly for once as he pondered upon how best to find Farah, struck lucky when he noticed a forlorn figure seated at the bus stop. "Want to talk about it? Come on, hop in, I don't bite." He stopped to offer her a lift, secure in the knowledge that she would accept and that he would get some answers. Except she didn't. Accept, that is. "Why would I get in with you?" She sent him a sceptical look through tear-stained eyes that made him feel like something she'd scraped off the bottom of her shoe. "You're in with them." "Come again? Who's them?" She made a sound that could have been anything from a hiccup to a derisive grunt. "Like you don't know?" Isaac scratched his head, blocking the narrow road with his car as he tried to think how best to circumvent her anger. He couldn't remember the last time that a woman had declined to do anything he asked of her, and her reaction only served to increase his determination. It would have done so even if he wasn't keen to know what had gone on between her and Dale. She eventually got into his car, albeit with bad grace, and stared sullenly ahead. He knew better than to try to engage her in conversation, and kept silent until the smooth rumble of the engine lulled her to sleep. He sent frequent sideways glances at her, admiring her creamy complexion, her delicate features and her full, sensual mouth. He felt himself reacting in the time-honoured fashion and was glad that her eyes were closed against the obvious evidence. The last thing he wanted her to think was that he intended to jump her bones, even if the possibility possessed unprecedented appeal. His growing awareness of his feisty companion's character added to Isaac's doubts about the running of Guy's yard. He sensed an abiding conscientiousness in her and knew, hoped at least, that she wouldn't be a party to any shady business, especially if it threatened the well-being of the horses she loved. Her physical attributes had nothing to do with his willingness to believe her before she'd opened her mouth. Her determination to take on Dale had already swayed him, especially since Isaac knew he'd lied to him about Force's supposed ailments. Something most definitely wasn't right, and he could only get to the bottom of that conundrum with Farah's help. Isaac ground his jaw as he concentrated on driving. If he were being somehow manipulated, or his horses maltreated, then he sure as hell wanted to know about it. Despite what Dale seemed to think, he most definitely didn't have more money than sense. That was the thing about being a self-made man. You understood all the wrinkles, had invented half of them yourself on the way up the greasy pole of success, and knew how to play dirty if necessary. "Ever been in such a lowly pub before?" she asked, waking with a jolt when he pulled up outside the Fox and Ferret. He sent her a curious look. "Why wouldn't I have been? I go to pubs, just like everyone else." "Probably gastropubs. This place is spit and sawdust, log fires and low beams." She sent him a challenging grin. Clearly, dozing for a few minutes had revived her, and she was ready to give as good as she got again. "Don't say you haven't been warned." "Warning duly noted. You're local, is it?" he asked, cutting the engine and opening his door. "I live fairly close, sure," she replied, climbing elegantly from the low car. "But I don't go to pubs much. I have to get up early for work." Isaac nodded, and after locking the car, placed a hand in the small of her back as he guided her towards the door. They must have made an incongruous couple, he thought, him in his Savile Row suit, and her in jodhpurs, an old check shirt and body warmer, her feet in the muddy boots she'd warned him about. Isaac simply didn't care. He thought she looked fresh-faced and gorgeous. He couldn't remember when he'd last had dealings with a lady who wasn't caked in makeup and dressed to impress. Or if he ever had been impressed, that is. This one was angry and upset, and clearly didn't trust him, but she was ready to fight her corner, despite the disparity in their situations. He liked that about her. That and a whole lot else. "What will you have?" he asked, walking up to the bar and ducking his head to avoid one of the low beams she'd warned him to expect. The bar was half full of mostly working men, sipping half pints or lager straight from the bottle. They sent Isaac mildly curious looks, and he realised how out of place he must appear. This was very much Farah's territory, and yet he felt totally at home, liking the ambience more than the plastic bars and restaurants he spent so much of his working life frequenting. "Morning all," he said, nodding affably. A few men nodded in response. Most didn't. "Hiya, Farah," the young barman said, flashing a smile at her and then bestowing a suspicious frown on Isaac. "How's Daisy?" "Good and bad days," Farah said, looking thrown by the question. "Send her my best." "Will do." She turned to face Isaac. "I'll have white wine," she said. "It's been one of those days. It's almost noon, and I've been up since 6, so—" Isaac wondered why she felt the need to explain herself. Presumably, drinking at such an early hour wasn't something she made a habit out of. He ordered the best wine they had on the list, and, mindful of the fact that he was driving, a bottle of low-alcohol lager for himself. He collected up both drinks and steered her towards a quiet table close to the window. She sat down and took the glass that he handed to her. "Thanks," she said, taking a long sip. "Cheers," she added belatedly. "Cheers." He saluted her with his bottle. "I guess you needed that." When she didn't respond, he tried a question. "Who's Daisy?" he asked. "Your friend the barman mentioned her," he added when she blinked at him in evident confusion. "My aunt. She has MS." "That's tough." "Yeah, it is. These things always happen to the good guys, not the old bastards." "Like Dale?" he suggested mildly. Her body jerked forward, and Isaac knew he had finally secured her complete attention. "What do you know about that?" she asked acerbically. "I knew he'd told you to come after me. Easy." Isaac held up a placating hand, worried that she might actually get up and walk out on him. "Do I look like the type to take orders from the Dales of this world?" "Appearances can be deceptive. And excuse me, but you don't know much about horses, so we'll believe whatever bullshit he feeds you." "Like Force being lame?" he said softly into the ensuing silence, reaching a hand inside his collar, unfastening the top button of his shirt and loosening his tie. She watched him and seemed fascinated, but whether by the simple gesture or because he doubted the line fed to him about Force, he had yet to decide. You challenged Dale?" "Well," she added, not waiting for a response, but clearly pondering the situation, "if he saw you parked out back, and let's face it, no one could possibly miss that car of yours. It's not exactly low profile. But anyway, he will know you drove past Force's paddock." "I don't think he saw my car, distinctive or not," Isaac replied, smiling at her provocative tone and not seeing any need to defend his choice of vehicle, no matter how flashy. He'd damned well earned the right to do as he pleased. "He left the tack room after your dispute and came straight to the barn, where he fed me the line about Force. I pretended to believe him." "Why?" She issued the one word as a challenge, clearly reluctant to get her hopes up. "Why what?" She huffed impatiently. "Don't pretend not to understand me. I'm not one of the airheads you date." She clamped a hand over her mouth, but a brief smile, the first he had seen from her, slipped past her defences. "Sorry," she added, not looking or sounding the least bit sorry. That was uncalled for. I am flattered that you follow my activities so closely. Don't be. You're all over the tabloids when you so much as sneeze. Copies get left hanging around the tack room. Impossible to miss. Well, that's me told. Isaac chuckled and leaned back in his chair, unable to decide when he had last enjoyed a day quite so much. He must definitely be more spontaneous in future, he decided, thinking he liked what spontaneity could lead to. Being a control freak was overrated. Anyway, to answer your question, I knew the moment I saw Force in that paddock that something was seriously wrong. He shouldn't have been out to grass this close to race day, and he was most definitely not lame. Farah nodded. You're learning. Patronising responses aside, he said easily, you don't need the intellect of a rocket scientist to tell if a horse is lame. As to the race day procedure, I've been there, done that, and know the ropes. She bit her lower lip, and this time her smile was uncontrived. Sorry, she said, but we're used to owners having more money than sense. Ah, that was Dale speaking, not me. You suspect him of fixing races, don't you? Isaac replied. Farah felt totally out of her depth in the company of a glamorous man who had turned every female head in the pub when he'd walked in, and was clearly oblivious to the effect that he had on the clientele. There was more to him than a pretty face, she had already discovered. She told herself that she wouldn't have agreed to enter her local with him and set tongues wagging had she not fallen asleep and been taken unawares. But part of her also wondered if she was being delusional. He wasn't quite as ignorant as she'd supposed, although why that should surprise her she was at a loss to know. He would hardly have made such a mark for himself in the fiercely competitive world of high finance if he wasn't clever. And he was most definitely a hunk, she conceded, taking in the sharp, angular cut to a strong jaw decorated with designer stubble. In spite of herself, she'd been powerless not to admire his instinctively commanding stance as they'd walked into the pub, and he oozed machismo, dominating the bar as naturally as if he owned it. He'd caught her gaping at him when he loosened his collar. She'd seen powerful muscles shifting and flexing in his arms, and had been mesmerised by the sight. He certainly hadn't let his busy business life interfere with his physical fitness, and she would have had to be nearly blind, and 100, not to appreciate his animal vitality. But that didn't mean she had to trust him, did it? Although there again, why not take the chance, she wondered, as she took a healthy slug of her wine, feeling it slip effortlessly down her throat. She ordinarily drank the house plonk, rather than a decent Chablis, and couldn't pretend that she didn't enjoy the treat. It wasn't a case of trust, she decided. The worst Dale could do would be to badmouth her to the rest of the local yards, but since she would need to take an office job anyway, that didn't seem to matter. In the unlikely event that Isaac was Dale's spy, she would send a loud and clear message through him that she had no intention of keeping stum. Force shouldn't have gone upper class in his last race, she said, leaning forward and lowering her voice, even though there was little chance of their being overheard. Dale insisted that he was ready, but the rest of us disagreed. Don't forget that we, that's I, used to ride him out and know him better than anyone. She impatiently brushed aside an errant tear. We tried him against the better horses, and although he held his own, there was no way he would have overtaken them. I tried to tell Dale, but he wasn't having it. He's been in the game a long time. Perhaps he made a mistake. He's forgotten more about horses than I'm ever likely to know, she admitted, articulating her earlier thoughts about the man. Credit where credit's due, even if that's the only good thing I can think of to say about him. Has he always dismissed your opinions? No, that's the thing. Up until a few months ago, he would always take on board what we told him and almost always acted upon our advice. As he himself used to say, better coming from the horse's mouth. She rolled her eyes. His idea of a joke. What changed? Isaac asked. Say, would you like something to eat? Farah shook her head, but of course he ignored her. He went to the bar, brought her another glass of wine and came back with the menus. Why do you ask questions if you don't want to hear the answers? She asked, irritated and yet pleased that he seemed to want to prolong their time together. Beware what you wish for. Sure you're not hungry? He asked, flashing a sexy smile when she glanced at the menu, and her stomach gave an embarrassing rumble. Since you insist, I'll have the special. He chuckled, glanced at the chalkboard and nodded his approval. Good choice. I will too. He went back to the bar to place his order. Jenny, the buxom barmaid, was now helping out since the bar had filled up with the lunchtime crowd. Farah wasn't surprised when she ignored others waiting ahead of Isaac and leaned on the bar to give him a full-on view of her impressive cleavage as she took her time placing his order and Isaac turned on the charm. She caught snatches of their conversation, from which it was clear that Jenny was interrogating him quite ruthlessly, but Isaac deflected her questions without giving anything away about himself, no doubt having been in this situation many times before. Jenny glanced at Farah when Isaac turned his back to return to their table and fanned her face with her hand, making Farah smile. Jenny was a good sort, despite being a self-confessed man-eater. Like what you see? Farah could have bitten her tongue off when the question slipped out, and she felt herself blushing like a schoolgirl. Jealous? Insanely, she replied with a rueful grin. Sorry, but I've had one hell of a day and been fired from a job I love, so make allowances. I do like Jenny, but be warned, she takes no prisoners, and it looks like she has you on her breakfast menu. Isaac laughed, relaxed and apparently unconcerned. I'll bear that in mind. I dare say you get that sort of thing a lot, Farah said, leaning her elbow on the table and her chin on her clenched fist. She had started on her second glass of wine. They were very large glasses, and she was feeling increasingly mellow. Success breeds its fair share of hangers-on, he conceded. You must know that from the racing game. It wasn't his success, but more his looks, that had prompted the comment, but she wasn't about to clarify and allowed the misconception to stand. His disgusting self-confidence didn't need a boost from her. I see a lot, she agreed. Too much, and have yet to learn to keep my mouth shut. If I could do that, then perhaps... Her words trailed off, and she stared morosely into her glass, the convivial mood shattered by recollections of her unemployed status. More people in your world should have the courage of their convictions. You have, and I admire that about you. His words put Farah in mind of her appearance, and she experienced a sudden desire to be admired for herself. She shrugged, dismissing the whimsical thought. With her hair hastily tied back and not brushed since first light, in her scruffy, unsophisticated stable clothes and without makeup, there was little chance of anyone giving her a second glance, especially not the Adonis seated across from her. But, inexplicably, she knew that she had his full attention and that he was in no hurry to be on his way. She wondered about that. He must have a zillion things to do, but gave the impression that he had all the time in the world. His phone had rung constantly, but he'd merely glanced at the screen each time and not taken the calls. Odd. 2 steaming plates of coq au vin were delivered to their table by Jenny herself. She grinned at Farah, plonked a plate in front of her, and fanned her face dramatically again, out of sight of Isaac. Or perhaps not. The man appeared to see everything. She then turned to him and made a big fuss out of serving his meal, which required a great deal of bending over. Farah couldn't help giggling, which brought a smile to Isaac's face and sent Jenny scuttling back to the bar. "You should laugh more often," Isaac said. "It suits you." "I haven't had a great deal to laugh about recently." She cut into her chicken, took a bite, and closed her eyes as she savoured the taste. "Lovely," she said. "The new chef here is making quite a name for himself, hence this crowd on a weekday lunchtime in a country pub." Isaac tasted his own food. It probably wasn't a scratch on what he would be accustomed to in the fancy restaurants he frequented that charged a month's salary for a lettuce leaf. Even so, horses for courses, as was the saying in her previous line of work. She would be interested to see if his response would be scathing or artificially complimentary. "The chef's got that dark tang from the red wine exactly right," he said, nodding in evident approval. "And the herby aromatic taste is spot on too." "Not too rustic for you?" she asked, wondering why she felt so determined to pick a fight with him. He flexed a brow, looking lazily amused. "I take food very seriously and never offer false praise," he told her. "Good to know." "I did all the cooking in our house growing up. It was either that or starve. Not many people know that." "Don't worry, your secret's safe with me. It wouldn't do your Playboy image much good if the truth got out." Even so, the comment was telling and set Farah wondering. He made it sound as though his upbringing had been disadvantaged, and she still struggled with that concept. The more she got to know about him, the less she understood what made him tick. "You've got me all wrong," he replied, waving his fork in the air for emphasis. "But I guess you believe everything you read in those magazines of yours." "Not all," she said, grinning as she waggled a hand from side to side in a considering gesture. "Anyway, where were your parents when you were whipping up these culinary masterpieces?" Now that's a discussion best kept for when we know one another better." His expression closed down, and Farah knew she had struck a nerve. "Sorry, didn't mean to pry. I expect you get that a lot too." He didn't immediately respond, and instead they both concentrated on their food, soaking up the sauce with fresh, crusty bread. "Tell me more about your suspicions," he eventually said, pushing his empty plate aside and leaning back in his chair. "I assume you think Dale is behind whatever's going on, which, if you'll excuse me for saying so, makes your confronting him without actual evidence seem a bit dumb. I assume you don't have any evidence?" She shook her head. "Thought not, so what made you do it?" He smiled that glamorous smile of his, flashing even white teeth that were probably the product of ruinously expensive dentistry. She admired the way that his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. She admired too damn much about him, and adjured herself to stick to the subject under discussion. Concerned about being played for a fool, she could well imagine how badly that would go down with him. "Come on, no avoiding the question." That smile had distracted her, and right now she was having trouble recalling her own name. She shook her head. "Actually, it's our head lad, I suspect. I know he's in debt and likes to gamble." "You're not allowed to place bets on horses from your own yard, are you?" She again shook her head, this time at his naivety. "That's not to say someone else can't place them on your behalf. It happens all the time." She held up a hand. "I never bet. I can't afford to. But a lot of the lads do. Jonah, the head lad, has been with Guy since he set up here and knows everyone of note in the industry." She allowed a significant pause, including all the bookies and their runners. "The runners come up to the gallops and watch the horses in training?" "Yes, but that isn't enough to get the inside scoop, so to speak. If I've got it right, then someone is paying off their gambling debts by talking out of turn." "I'd kind of decided it must be something like that," Isaac said, his earlier smile replaced with a grim expression. Someone encouraged Dale.